So, you've probably heard the term decision fatigue, right? But what if I told you it's not just some productivity buzzword? What if it's actually a silent, critical threat to your performance that you might be seriously underestimating? Yeah, the story almost always starts right here. Steve Jobs with his iconic black turtleneck, Mark Zuckerberg with the same gray t shirt every day. The idea is they simplified their wardrobe to save precious mental energy for the big stuff. It's a nice, tidy little story. But what if that's just scratching the surface? What if focusing on the t-shirts is causing us to miss a much, much bigger danger? Because the truth is, decision fatigue isn't about convenience. It's about the very integrity of your judgment. So in this explainer, we're going to go way beyond the cliches. We'll look at the hard science, we'll examine some frankly alarming real-world consequences, we'll tally up the true costs, and then, most importantly, we'll lay out a strategic plan to protect your most valuable asset. So first, let's just reframe this whole conversation. This is not about saving a few minutes in the morning. It's about recognizing a critical vulnerability that affects every single high-stakes decision you have to make later in the day. Now, let's get into the mechanics of it. What's actually happening inside your brain from a scientific perspective? Because I want to be clear, this isn't some fuzzy metaphor. It's a biological reality. The technical term is, of course, decision fatigue. And here's the best way to think about it. Your brain's prefrontal cortex, the part that handles all the heavy lifting like complex thought and self-control, it's like a muscle. Every choice you make, big or small, is like one rep at the gym. And just like a muscle, it gets tired.
And the sheer volume of those reps, it's just staggering. Research from McKinsey shows that executives spend nearly 40% of their time just making decisions. That is a massive, relentless drain on your cognitive energy, day in and day out.
So what happens when that mental energy tank starts running low? Well, this is where the research gets genuinely alarming and reveals just how fragile our good judgment can actually be. To really get the real-world impact, we have to look at probably the most famous study on this topic. Researchers analyzed over 1,000 judicial rulings from Israeli parole boards, and they were hunting for a pattern. What they found was, well, it was shocking. They compared the decisions judges made at 2 different times, early in the day or right after a food break, versus late in a session when they were tired and probably hungry. Now, we're talking about the same judges, the same types of cases, but drastically different outcomes. The results were just so stark. When the judges were fresh, the parole approval rate was hovering around 65%. But as the day wore on, as their cognitive resources were completely depleted, that rate plummeted to nearly zero. The easiest, safest default decision was simply to say no. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. A person's actual freedom depended less on the facts of their case and more on what time of day their case was heard. The crucial point here is that fatigue led them to default to the status quo. And it's not just judges. Another study found that surgeons were 33 percentage points less likely to schedule unnecessary surgery for a patient they saw at the end of their shift compared to the beginning. Again, it's the same pattern. The default choice, in this case, let's not operate yet, required less mental effort. And believe it or not, it gets even worse. Psychologists have actually identified something called the morning morality effect. The research shows that as our cognitive resources drain throughout the day, we are statistically more likely to engage in unethical behavior, to cut corners, fudge the numbers, or make questionable calls. Our willpower literally gets worn out. Okay, so let's connect all this back to leadership. When your brain is this tired, it doesn't just affect small choices. It actively sabotages your strategy and puts you on a direct path to burnout. So what does this actually look like in practice? Well, you might start avoiding decisions, just pushing them off. Or you default to the safe, status quo option every time. You might find yourself becoming impulsive about little things, but then incredibly risk-averse on the big things. And that increased irritability, it's a classic symptom. You have to understand that this constant strain, that feeling of being mentally fried day after day, is a primary driver of executive burnout. It's not just about stress, it's the cognitive depletion that comes with the job. But here's the good news. This is not an inevitable fate. Once you understand the mechanism, you can build a real strategy to protect yourself. So let's look at how to build that recovery plan. Here are 4 key strategies. First, protect your peak hours. Do your heavy mental lifting in the morning when you're fresh. Second, reduce the trivial decisions. That's the real lesson from the black turtleneck. Automate the small stuff. Third, build in recovery. Remember the judges? Their judgment literally reset after a break. Breaks aren't a luxury, they are essential maintenance. And fourth, delegate strategically. Not every decision has to be yours. Empowering your team is good for them, and it preserves your own mental fuel. So I'll leave you with this question to really think about. Based on everything we've just seen, are you really the same person making decisions late in the afternoon as you were first thing in the morning? The evidence says no, not even close. And that brings us to the most important takeaway of all. Acknowledging that your brain has limits isn't a sign of weakness. It's profound wisdom. And consciously designing your work, your schedule, and your decision-making processes around this biological reality, that isn't just a defensive move. It's the ultimate strategy.